Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very first EuropeanaTech webinar on the topic of acoustics. My name is Gregory Marcus. I'm from the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision, and I have been one of the EuropeanaTech community managers for the past 9 years. I put this webinar together with my colleague, Andrea, from the EuropeanaTech steering group, because it was something that had been brought to my attention by one of the panelists, Pamela Jordan. And all of a sudden a light bulb went off and I thought, wow, this is something that seems extremely relevant for EuropeanaTech, but to my knowledge had never been really covered in any sort of intent manner. So we decided to start putting attention on it in an intent manner. And this webinar is our first effort to bring the topic of heritage acoustics to the EuropeanaTech community and the Europeana network at large, to see what kind of interest there is and how the entire Europeana network of all its thousands of members can help and explore and dig deeper into this topic. And very simply put, that will be it. We have 4 wonderful speakers today, and I will now pass the mic over to my co-hosts. One last thing before I pass to Andrea, put your questions in the chat and we will get to them as they come in. So just feel free to drop them in whenever you have them, and we'll take them when we can as they come in. So with that, I pass now over to Andrea to also share his insights and motivations for helping organize this webinar.
Hello, warm welcome to our guests and to attendees. Thank you for your interest. I think, as Greg said, that this is the first time we pay attention of this issue, which I think is very important, especially for the early music professionals. So they, thanks to those datas, and we can now hope we are able to play in those spaces which are not exist anymore. And not only early music professionals, I think also for the antique theater would be also very exciting to reconstruct the antique dramas into the authentic acoustic space, which are damaged through the years. So I hope you enjoy in our webinar, and as Greg said, please put your question in a chat. Good luck and enjoy.
Thank you. And so first up, we have Pamela Jordan, reporting live from Berlin, but researcher at the University of Amsterdam. Pamela, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, organizers of this event. I'm happy to get started on the conversation from my little hotel room here. It's a real pleasure to join you. So I thought I would start off maybe the conversation by explaining a little bit about how I use psychoacoustics in particular in my research of heritage sites. And these heritage sites range from modern infrastructure to ancient sanctuaries, and I figured I would pick the most extreme example of recording sound and history and built space by taking the example of an ancient sanctuary to Zeus from the Peloponnese in Greece as my example for how I want to talk to you today about how we record sound and its relationship to the development of built space in time, but in particular, how human perception of that sound is so critical to understanding those relationships. That's what I try to do in my use of psychoacoustics. So I thought I would show a little bit of how I apply that in the field and hopefully raise a lot of issues about how we are recording sound in heritage spaces, to then have a discussion about what are we recording, how are we recording it, how are we using those documents. So when I am recording sound in space, one of the questions, of course, is what are we actually hearing? And what does that have to do with the past or an ancient past? I essentially approach sound as an artifact of potential practice in a past. And perception is the explanation for that artifact. And the challenge, of course, is to render perception comparable, to make perception or perceptive recordings data that I can then compare and draw inferences and conclusions from. And the way that I do this is so far I've been using a binaural recording system by Acoustics that allows me to capture a very high fidelity quality of sound recording from the space, but also to then analyze the recordings according to psychoacoustic metrics like perceived loudness, roughness, and other approximations of the complexity of the human hearing and how we perceive sound, the pattern recognition, the way we're able to identify foreground and background sounds, the way we adapt very quickly in time to certain characteristics. And then use that for analysis of a site to uncover its history. The site that I am talking about, this Mount Lycaon, sanctuary to Zeus, we know very little about its actual day-to-day practices. That's the mystery of it, in fact. In ancient Greek architecture, we know what certain buildings were for, but we don't know all of the interstitial activities, and that really is the challenge here. The landscape itself is, in a way, the architecture, because it is the most intact piece that's left. As you can see, there really isn't that much in terms of the architecture still standing. But we can see floor plates. As an architect, I approach the entire site as an architectural challenge to understand how it was used and how sound facilitated its use and the practices therein. And of course, when I was there, I could hear, as many of you have probably experienced in a mountainous landscape, highly unusual sonic characteristics and acoustic renderings that were happening within this space where communication can happen across vast distances. And that isn't just interesting, that actually can perhaps offer some insight into how the site could have been used ritualistically. One of the main activities that were here, this is a plan of that lower sanctuary, was the ritualized athletic competitions in honor of Zeus. These were public. Lots of people would come and gather. So the mountain functioned as an auditorium for this, as a stage. And it's not impossible to imagine how the architects would come into a space already with a speaker system in place and use it to accentuate certain relationships. So when I find a piece of architecture that has a relationship to a natural hillside, for instance, that allows me to start to think about the relationship between those things acoustically and what was ritualistically able to be shared between those two by sound. But it isn't just the sound, it's how we perceive it that makes the difference. So the way that I do this is I essentially use a modified impulse response test, where I use a set of control sounds that I play on a speaker. I place that speaker in a position of interest. In this case, I have it on what we call seats, not sure if they're seats. And then I go around with that very portable headset, the binaural recorder, and record how that sound is received in many different positions. And then I simply repeat that process over and over again. And that allows me to create an imbricated network of recordings of data points, where I can then compare the recordings of the same sound from 2 different locations or 5 different locations, and understand not only how they sounded different, but how they could be perceived differently. And so it doesn't require me to have a live rendering of my own perception. I now have a recording of it that I can analyze for perceptive qualities. Let me give you an example. So I just said that one of the places of interest are those seats. We're not exactly sure what they look at, why they're pointed in the direction they are, but they run parallel to a ridgeline and a hillside that's fairly centrally located within the lower sanctuary. This is the ridgeline here. You can see my wonderful assistant, recording assistant there. And I've highlighted the hillside here on the right. Excuse me a moment. There we go. So these are the 2 positions that I'm looking at. And I want to understand their relationship sonically, so I can understand ritualistically how they could have been connected. So one technique, simply use a recording of white noise, project it from both directions and see how much sound is retained. And as you can see, this is a comparison being projected from one direction and then the other direction and recorded. And compared, you can see that there's a fairly similar amount of sound power being retained. So there is a fairly, let's say, reciprocal relationship between how much sound can be exchanged between those two positions quite clearly. Another example, let's now move from the seats back to the stoa, which is a very long, thin building, public. That kind of function, we do know a little bit about what was happening there, and see the relationship between that building, which also runs parallel to that ridgeline. In this case, I can do a transfer function analysis and see that indeed, between these two positions, we have a lot of the sound power that looks similar between the two positions. So there is, again, a somewhat reciprocal relationship. Lots of details to get into that I'm skipping over for brevity, but this is simply according to how the sound is moving in the space between two positions. Now, let's talk about perception for a moment. What I'm showing you is, let's say, version 1.0 of a test that I've been doing. It's since perhaps gotten hopefully a little bit more sophisticated, but I essentially play a series of pure tones that allow me to analyze pattern recognition and differentiate it really visually from the complexity of the background recording. This recording was made in an anechoic chamber. So in theory, no other sonic influence here. On the top spectrogram, we can see how the sound was moving in that space. So we can see the intensity points of these different tones. If I run a psychoacoustic analysis according to specific loudness on that exact same recording, we can see how the human ear, the average human hearing, is actually perceiving that sound, very clearly differentiating each tone from any of the kind of background noise that might be there, and how strong, how intense the entire tone is in comparison to what we would see in an FFT analysis. So now let's apply this to the site. If I run that same sound file, and here I play it from the hippodrome surface up to that same hillside, we can see in the spectrogram a few of the tones. They stand out a little bit, but it's really quite similar to the background sound. It doesn't seem to be a lot of differentiation. If I simply looked at an FFT analysis, simply looked at how the sound was moving, simply listened to that, I would think that there is not that much, let's say the sonic relationship between those two positions. I wouldn't be receiving a lot of the information being projected to me from the hippodrome surface until I do a specific loudness analysis on that file, which allows me to understand that the human ear is very capable actually of differentiating those tones very strongly against all of the wind that's happening down here in this lower register, all of the goat bells that are in the distance, any chirping of birds, any interference. These tones are quite prominent, quite differentiated, quite strong, which substantiates the observation that in fact between these two positions, you can have a spoken conversation. They might be about 55 meters away. I can have a spoken conversation at this level. So this allows me not only to substantiate observations, but to actually start to talk about there's a significant difference between a simple recording of sound in a space, of how the sound is moving, the acoustics of that space, and the perception of that sound. So I'd like to challenge us to think about how we can possibly record perception when we're talking about recording a space. And this has implications for all of the kind of rendering that we can then make for 3D projections of these spaces, perhaps spaces that no longer exist. How can we think about not only the sound in that space, but the perception of sound in that space and what the influences on that would be? So with that, I'll thank you all for your kind attention this morning and looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. No questions in the chat, no worries though, because I have one. As usual, I have several, but it seems like this research is wholly site specific, correct?
In each site, it is site specific, yes. Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, there is how do you develop, let's say, a standardized methodology as your starting point to then grow upon once you start exploring each site and its unique characteristics?
Well, I might call it a reciprocal relationship. And I come with tools in my pocket. So of course I use the same recording technique, the concept of an impulse response, and analyze it in the same way in each space. But what changes, of course, is what the space is, what I know about what the space was used for, if anything. So for instance, if I know that a space like Mount Lycaon or a bullet factory, which is another site I've studied, was used predominantly in a cacophonous way. There was a lot of sound interference. There was a lot of activity that was happening that someone would have to differentiate sounds from. What kind of sounds would have been a part of that? Then I have to recalibrate what my expectations are of not only what I'm hearing and my cultural expectations of that, but then what would have potentially been the expectations of someone using that space originally. So when we're talking about perception, it's really important to keep the context in mind and know that there's no real way that I can be fully in the perceptive context of the original users. It's impossible. So I have to keep that humility always in the forefront. And I would say that is perhaps the most important calibration I have to do in each site. But the tools themselves, they're pretty flexible, but the way that I use it, that's pretty consistent.
Oh, we have some, thank you.
Mhm.
We have some questions coming in. We'll take, yeah, Julian?
Yeah, just if I understand, you work on study on the speech and the acoustic on this situation. Have you worked with music and in this case, because I think it's your study was very interesting for me, and I think in this archaeological perspective, your work with music was very interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I've really wanted to engage some knowledge keepers who use ancient instruments. And let me say, so I have not used or benefited from anyone playing immediately within the context of my research, in the sense that I brought them in and had them play in certain positions and listen to it in that way. I think it'd be a really interesting way to take the research. I think it's also possible through convolution analysis with the data that I'm gathering, that could happen. So I'm not particularly concerned as long as I get high enough quality data that analysis could be done. I have to be satisfied with that because I'm only one person at this point. However, in that site, for instance, on the Mount Lycaon, there are, very briefly, there are recreations that are done every 4 years in the community. And part of that, the recreations, are people that come who know how to play the original instruments that could have been played there and sing in a manner that in ancient Greek. So I've been able to hear that kind of performance, not in the strategic, please play here, but I heard them on the Hippodrome and I was able to listen to it around the site, and it was enlightening. It was quite fascinating what they were capable of doing. So I think you're spot on. It's a really important piece to integrate when music was a part of it. And I'm hopeful I can.
No, it's a big work. Thanks a lot for your work. Thanks a lot.
And there's one last question from the chat, and it is a big one, a simple and a big one. And the question is, what are your main difficulties in your work?
Oh, well.
Let's pick the hardest, the biggest difficulty.
Having enough time and gathering enough data that's the right data. So the problem is you can record all day, every day, and it's the piece that I find the most challenging that I've had to work on as I've been doing this research is understanding when I have the data I need and when it's enough. So what is comparable data? And that's really shifted over time. what I thought was comparable data, acoustic data in 2015 is not the same as I think in 2022. So I would say that was my biggest challenge. The bugs were a good challenge in the beginning, but I got over that.
Does more time equal more data?
It can, but actually I'm trying to make that the reverse relationship. I'm trying to make it so that the more time I have, the less data I have, because I'm gathering the right data.
More meaningful data. Cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. All right. Thank you very much, Pamela.
Thank you.
Can I say, ask something or comment something
Yeah.
regarding the music in the historical area and the acoustic? I think it's very important to follow the historical tunes. I think it would be a mistake to play music in a contemporary tuning system. It must follow the antique tuning system
Oh, yeah.
based on Pythagoras.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. Yep.
Yeah,
I'll
and
keep it in mind.
the tones you mentioned, recording and in a deaf room, so to say. Is this in a contemporary tuning system?
Oh, it's not even a tuning system. They're pure tones.
Yeah,
they're
but pure
random.
tones, every tone have its value regarding the frequency, and that frequency is in some tuning system.
Fair.
If it's tone.
Fair enough. I'm going to consult you when I remake my tones for the next time.
Thank you. Excellent work.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pam. So next up, we have Julian and Julian, both from Sorbonne, correctly, or from Sorbonne. And then I can't pronounce the name of your university, Julian Fernando.
Julien, it's Aix-Marseille University.
Okay, Aix-Marseille University.
And CNRS laboratory. I present if you want. Okay, thanks a lot. I'm Julian from PRISM Laboratory, an interdisciplinary CNRS unity of Aix-Marseille University, which brought together between acoustic musicology, movie studies, and medicine. I would like to present the project IMAPI in English, musical interpretation in immersive heritage acoustics. It is an interdisciplinary project between acoustic and musicology. Its main objective is to reconstruct the acoustic of the Great Chapel of the Pope Palace of Avignon in the south of France, built for Clement VI and inaugurated in 1352. With this project, we wanted to develop an experimental research on interpretation of heritage music in the context of real-time acoustic simulation. In addition to audio modeling, IMAPI allows professional singers to be immersed in an experimental acoustic device and to extend research into historically informed practice, and also the musical gesture that result from them. The research program is conceived in a totally interdisciplinary art science context. IMAPI is composed of several modules: acoustic modeling, study of the musical gesture in a 3D artifact, and heritage enhancement with the integration of the 3D recording in the Ars Musica guided tour of the Palace of Pope. This project is constituted by a strong collaboration signed 2020 around the realization of the IMAPI project. Different exchange was realized between the PRISM laboratory acoustic teams in Aix-en-Provence and the LAM acoustic team laboratory of Sorbonne University of Paris. IMAPI is integrated to the project EVA Fund of Notre Dame of Paris. It is also an important collaboration with a musical ensemble, Diabolus in Musica, French ensemble very important for medieval music, is a key element in the realization of this project. Okay. The progressive installation of Papacy of Avignon will allow the city to become the center of the Christian world, but also a favorable area for the art of music. In this context, a setting worthy of welcoming the successor of St. Peter was built between 1366 and 1362. Through its design and its various architectural layers, this Palace of Popes, and in particular its great chapel, became a major acoustic setting for the sound of polyphony. The sound emanating from the spoken word as well as from music is a key element in the exercise of papal power. Its itself at the heart of plural medieval culture in which transmission is essentially through the spoken word and sound. It is closely linked to the notion of timbre, but also of resonance. In fact, acoustic sound and the reception of the musical enable the pop to be positioned at the heart of the real ecosystem dominated by sound. To this end, the EuropeanaTech project was launched in 2020 in order to carry out precise modeling of the musical space of the Great Chapel. Okay. Pope Clement VI introduced a splendor in this court for its election. He decided to enlarge the Papal Palace and adapt it to a new theological and political imperatives, which is the construction of the Great Chapel, divided into 7 bays, dedicated to St. Peter and St. Paul. The ceremonial space, broadcasting and reception area, is also adapted and organized to disseminate the pontifical word of a large scale. For your project, it was therefore necessary to document precisely the state of knowledge of the listening condition, as well as the reception areas. The result of this work enabled us to take up the extremely precise modeling of the space created by the Histopad company for the guided tour of museum, but also to reinterpret it through the prism of musicology and to adapt if it's necessary. In particular, it was an opportunity to refocus the research work on archival sources concerning the use and expenses for the Pontifical Chapel and to clearly construct different hypotheses concerning the place of the singer and the impact of the furniture which could interfere with the sound of their performance. Okay, as far as the Pontifical Chapel is concerned, la suite, Julien, we realize today that the bare state of the building does not give us any idea of the initial situation in which the counter musician who largely contribute to the development of the political polyphonic repertoire were evolving. Question of acoustic have already been present in various works. The space here is organized around the first 3 bays, and in particular the Parcus Cantorum, the space of the singer in Latin. In addition to the presence of the styles, there is an evidence of the purchase of a large quantity of hangings. The reconstructed space in relation to the musician is quite different from today. These elements have made it possible to adjust and readapt the original model. Okay, a corpus of 5 pieces polyphonic of music was selected for the experiment. The objective was to have a repertoire coherent with the situation of your model, sufficiently varied in its writing techniques or its link with the Papacian ceremonial. The work with the Ensemble of Diabolus et Musica and Antoine Gerber, its musical director, allowed us to constitute a choice of pieces.
All right, thank you, Julien, and good morning, everyone. So I'm the other Julien, Julien de Murinck. I'm a doctoral student in room acoustics at Institut Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, Sorbonne University, under the supervision of Brian Katz. We aim at reconstructing the acoustics of cultural heritage space. And so today I'm gonna present the geometrical acoustic model that we constructed of the Great Chapel of the Palais des Papes for the MAPI project. And I'll explain a bit also about the experiments that we carried out with the singers from Diabolus in Musica. So here you can see on this picture a visualization of the geometrical acoustic model of the Great Chapel that we constructed that allows to generate the acoustics with variable conditions, including true historical states, as I will develop later. So to do that, the first thing that we have to do is to carry out some room impulse response measurement of the modern day chapel. That's what you can see on these pictures here, to get an idea of the actual acoustics of the modern day chapel. Then we constructed the geometry of the chapel based on an already existing 3D model, but also on a 3D laser scan. So basically, as you can see on the bottom picture, the chapel is essentially an empty volume with no regular columns nor any other architectural elements such as galleries, and all the surfaces are constructed of dense limestone. Please note here that the white blocks represent the audience that has an impact on the acoustics of a room, as I will explain later. In a third step, we performed what we call the acoustic calibration of the model, which means adjusting the acoustic properties of the materials until the simulations match the measurement. So on these graphs here, you can see a comparison between the simulated and the measured values of different acoustic metrics that we use in this acoustic calibration procedure. So at that stage, we dispose of an acoustically calibrated model of the modern day chapel. But since we are also interested in the acoustics of the same chapel in the medieval era, we performed a kind of a time regression of the model, which means that we modified it by including some elements of furnishing and decoration from the medieval era. And we did that based on some historical records the elements of furnishing and decoration that were used during the papal masses in the 14th century. So here, this is a picture of the modern day chapel, and now this is a picture of the medieval chapel. So here, the different colors represent the different materials that were used in the chapel. So we have, for example, wall tapestries in pink all around the chapel. On the floor, we have some rush matting. There are also a number of wooden seating elements, canopies above the altar and the throne, etc., which all have an impact on the acoustic. So if we quickly compare the acoustics of the modern day and the medieval chapels, you can see on this graph, for example, so the blue and the orange curves represent the reverberation time of the modern day chapel, respectively without and with audience, whereas the yellow and pink curves represent the reverberation time of the medieval chapel, respectively without and with audience. So as we can see on this graph, the modern day chapel is much more reverberant, than the medieval chapel, and also that the inclusion of the audience tends to further reduce the reverberation time. All right, so we use this GA model to generate room impulse responses that were used in an experiment with singers from the ensemble Diabolus in Musica, as my colleague Julian already mentioned. The motivation of this experiment was to assess the impacts of the acoustics of the room on the musical performance. So the room impulse responses were used in real time in an oralization system. They were used to reconstruct what we call a virtual acoustic environment that was reproduced over headphones. So basically, each singer during the experiment was wearing a proximity microphone and a pair of headphones through which the virtual acoustic environment was reproduced. Maybe let's listen very quickly to some examples. So first, we'll hear a dry recording, so basically inside the recording room. So this is the voice of the singers without any type of oralization, without any type of reverberation. All right, and now this is an oralized version. That means this is what they were hearing while performing. All right, I hope that we all perceive the difference. Sorry. All right, so very quickly, during these experiments, we had different variable conditions. So the historical state, which I already mentioned. We also simulated two different positions of the choir in the chapel, and also two different arrangements of the singers along an arc centered on the conductor position, but also in a staggered arrangement, which is known to be an arrangement commonly used in the medieval masses. All right. So, well, the repertoire, you already mentioned that, Julian, I'm not gonna go through it. Just we have carried out a preliminary analysis. So basically we selected a subset of recordings and analyzed only one variable condition, the acoustical state. We analyzed different music features like timing, dynamics, timbre, and pitch, and we found out that the singers systematically sing louder in the modern acoustic compared to the medieval acoustics. These preliminary results were published in a recent study presented in the Symposium on the Acoustics of Ancient Theaters in Verona, Italy, earlier this year.
And for the end, during the around the use of digital device for some singers, the headset could give the impression of entering a virtual bubble, disconnected from the resonance of the face and body. The exchange with the changer also made it possible to realize that their interpretation in a high resonance could lead to a feeling of ease of being carried along by this acoustic, leading to a form of passivity without working of the details. In medieval acoustics, the opinion showed the opposite, with a sensation of detail, of increased difficulty because the singer is much more in the foreground and in relation to the other singer in the group, and of pushing the voice much more than in modern acoustics. Listening to each other is made easier, especially in the interpretation of musical polyphony music. And for the end, we can very interested to listen to a very short extract of Kyrie, 14th century polyphonic of Avignon, in different contexts, in a conductor situation, in modern, medieval, and pop's hearing. In the first situation.
Okay, so we'll start with the conductor position in the modern acoustics. Now from the same position, but in medieval acoustics. In medieval acoustic, but from the Pope's position, which is further away from the singers. We have two more examples. Do we have maybe 1 minute more or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. So this is another piece of music, Dominus in medieval acoustics, but now from the front seats, right, of the nave, Julian, is that correct?
Yeah, it's correct. It's a Gregorian chant. It's not a polyphonic.
Ah, okay. Let's go. Oh, sorry.
Per omnia secula seculorum. Amen.
And the same piece from the back of the nave. All right, that's all. Oops. Sorry for that. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Beautiful. We have one question in the chat from Mariana Goma, and they write, if I understand correctly, you are documenting acoustic environment, but you also refer to instrumental gestures. How are you documenting instrumental gestures through sound recordings, or is it through pictorial works?
Essentially, there are two sources. The repertory and technique of music was very interested to learn to understand the musical gesture, and of course the iconography. Iconography was a complementary of this work, and in fact, the problem was IMAP was on situation that we understand the musical gesture historic, but now, today, because historically gesture was very, very difficult to understand because it's so difficult to for the distance between medieval area. Are you understand?
Thank you.
Yeah, if I may add something, the last slide I had, maybe I can share it again. I don't know. It's an example of iconography, which can be found, I guess, in the Palais des Papes or in some archives, which show a medieval ensemble of singers gathered around the lectern, right? So here, for example, it's an example of a kind of a staggered arrangement. So this is an example of one aspect that we took into account for the experiments. This is why we decided to compare the staggered arrangement and an arc arrangement, which is like a usual arrangement of singers in the modern concerts, say. So this is, yeah, it was just to illustrate Julian's answer.
Thank you very much for elaborating on that. It definitely helped to add some context to the answer.
Can
yeah.
I, sorry?
Yeah, quickly.
As a early music professional, it's what's really interesting for me to hear the difference of acoustic, of modern and medieval. So the medieval acoustic sounds more natural than contemporary acoustic. The voices are pretty coherent together, and I think the singers are feeling much better without so large reverb, which is especially now.
So the thing is, like the modern day chapel is, as I said, it's only dense limestone. There's no furnishing, there's no soft material at all. So the space is highly reverberant. At low frequencies, it's more than 12 seconds of reverberation, which is huge. That's huge. So of course that makes it a very difficult space to sing in, right? So but that's a very particular situation. When we started to include the pieces of fabric in the model to make it correspond to the medieval times, it started to sound much, as you said, natural, or like much more damped. And it's true that we had some questionnaires for the singers on their feeling to sing in this space, like after the recording sessions, and several of them answered that it was a better situation for them to sing in the medieval acoustics. Also, the result of the analysis that I presented shows that they tend to sing louder in the modern space than in the medieval space. Which I don't know. I mean, that's just an hypothesis, but maybe they do that to kind of compensate for the the excess of reverberation in the modern space. So
but
yes, I can confirm that it must be sing louder in that space to fill this space with a volume of sound.
It's a first step of this experience here, of course, and I wish sincerely to make another experiences with singer with this model. It is a big experience.
We still have like many more recordings and different variable conditions to analyze.
Yeah.
For example, we could look into do they perform the same in polyphonic music and Gregorian chant? Maybe there's a difference. Maybe the acoustics of the performance space affect the way they sing, I don't know, polyphonic music and not Gregorian chant, or vice versa.
Yeah.
We still don't
Yeah.
know, but we still have to look into that. Those data.
And the difference time between Gregorian chant and polyphonic in medieval acoustic was very interested, because the music with time with a very different reaction for the Gregorian chant in this medieval acoustic. And I think it's a way of reflection for interpreting the Gregorian chant today, because Gregorian chant was not in acoustic very large in historically performance. I think it's the contrary, but it's the start of study.
Yeah.
We look forward to following your research further. And thank you, Pam.
Thank you.
For having
Thank
such
you.
beautiful audio examples. And I agree also the medieval version sounded more pleasing to the ears. But we move on. Aglaya from the University of York. You there?
Hello, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, hear you just fine. Over to you.
Okay, thank you again for the invitation. And actually, I'm kind of have a very strong links with the previous presentation from Julian and Julian. They have explained quite a lot of what I'm going to explain as well, of what our work is at the University of York. So I'm working at the University of York. I'm a research associate there for a project that is called Vesti, and it's the Past Has Ears. It's a European project that is collaborated with universities of Sorbonne and Parma from Italy. And that's why I know actually Julian from Sorbonne as well, that we are collaborating in this project. The university in Italy is working on the acoustic reconstruction of the Tintoret Theatre in Sicily, and the Notre Dame from the University from Sorbonne. They didn't talk today about that, but that's part of what they are actually doing as well. And what we are doing in this project as partners in this project is the acoustic reconstruction of the House of Commons in the House of Parliament in the UK. We're particularly interested in the House of Commons on the 1820s, and I will explain a bit more why we are focusing on this period. The space is in the Westminster Palace in London, but it's not what you actually see nowadays in the TV. It's not the same space. It has changed several times. It has been rebuilt several times. So I'm going to explain a bit the history of that and what we are aiming to reconstruct acoustically in this project. So we aim to explore, as I said, the space as it was before the fire. There was a big fire in the Westminster Palace in 1834 that destroyed the majority of the buildings, as well as the space that was used for the debates and the parliamentary debates back then. And this was the space before the fire, but I'll go a bit back to explain a bit the history of it. So the space was a chapel. It was a medieval chapel in the Westminster Palace, and it was, we don't have a lot of information about this chapel at the moment, so this is a virtual reconstruction of a previous project, also built from the University of York. The acoustic characteristics of this one hasn't been done yet, so we are hoping in the future we are going to focus on this one as well. But that was a chapel, a medieval chapel. Liturgies were happening in there. Later on, it was given to the House of Commons to be used for the debate. So we are talking now, the space has been given to the MPs, the members of the parliament, in 1568. And that was a space, something like that. Very little information, as I said, has been given to us how the space has changed from the medieval chapel to the House of Commons. And later on, we have several alterations in the space. And nowadays is the space, as you see here, the modern House of Commons. where we can actually see some similarities between the spaces. They have used that a quite unique way to sit. The MPs are sitting in the parliament. They are sitting facing each other in parallel rows across the walls. They are facing each other and debating in that way. And that had been the roots of that was from the medieval chapel, as the medieval chapel was built, and how the choir was sitting on the opposite sides on the walls. So they kept this architecture side, they kept it over the years, and through the medieval period as well, they kept the stalls where the choir was sitting, and they were debating in that way, facing each other. And that kept the architecture side, the political style, and they kept this style over the years up to nowadays. And we still see this unique way where the parliament is sitting facing each other. That gives us quite a few challenges, how the parliamentary people can actually listen to each other. So the acoustics is not as common as we expect in an amphitheater style sitting area. So this is the chapel, or the chapel hall as it is nowadays, but it's just built, this corridor in the Westminster Palace, on the remains of the original chapel. This is now a corridor. The modern House of Commons has been rebuilt in a slightly different place in the Westminster Palace. And here we kind of see how they tried to rebuild this chapel as it was back then. So there were many alterations over the years for this purpose. As a medieval chapel, it didn't really meet the purpose of debating. And after Reformation, after several changes in religion and civil wars and so on in history, in British history, they felt that the space had to change and had to follow these historical elements. So during the years, we had alterations from Wren in 1706, where he covered all the medieval characteristics of the space, all the statues, all the figures, all the big windows have now been covered with wooden panels. He had lowered the ceiling as well to make it, as we believe, and as we have some evidence as well from different committee reports, he tried to improve the acoustics of that space, because in the medieval chapel, it was more about music performance rather than a speech performance. So it was difficult to speak actually in that spaces. But he did some changes in that space, and we have images and drawings that showing us how that space have changed over the years through this alteration. So here it was in 1706, where Wren had that paneling and covering everything from the medieval chapel. And later on in 1806, we had a new MPs coming from Scotland, joining the debates, joining the parliament. So the space was overcrowded. There was no space for them to sit. There were it was a very uncomfortable place. Actually, they didn't have space. The capacity was limited. There was a lot of smoke from the candles. So we have a lot of information telling us that there was a big need for the space to be renovated back then. So in 1806, we have White trying as well to change again the space and make it bigger and larger in order to hold more people in there. So we see here the difference between the two spaces in these pictures. We have people that they are sitting between the windows, because what White have done, it was removing some of the original panels from White, bring them back to the original size of the medieval chapel, again paneling the windows with wood, but then created some extra spaces around the space for people to sit. So the information we have is limited on information like that, on engravings or paintings, some reports, some committing reports, and so on. The space then, that was one of the last images that we have from that period, 1833. Then in 1834, we have the big fire in the Westminster. Palace. And you see here, that's days after the fire, and you can still see here the fire pumps, that they are still in action. This space here on the right side is the top. So everything from the wooden panels we saw in the previous images had been destroyed, and we have just the fundamentals of the original chapel, which was actually demolished a few years later. So in the space that we are actually studying doesn't exist. So that's one of the challenges in acoustics. We can rebuild acoustically a space, having something like a reference of a space, of how it is now, how much has changed. What Julian and Julian actually showed you earlier, we have space now, and they calibrated of what it could be in the past based on the acoustic models. In this case, we didn't have anything really to compare, and I'll explain a bit more how we try to verify our results. So we have some architecture plans. So here you see on the boundaries here where I'm pointing with my cursor, you can see the original boundaries of the chapel. And then it was separated to lobby and the House of Commons. So the space was much smaller, and that was after Ren's renovations. And here you see also the galleries on top. So the additional, they added some galleries in order to, again, import some new spaces for the MPs to sit. Another interesting point that we are looking for in 1820s is the ventilation space. As I said, Ren had actually lowered the ceiling down, so there was a lot of space in the roof. And after 1820s, we have information that women were actually invited or were able to go and sit on the roof area because they weren't allowed to go in the main parliamentary space. So they were going to the roof area where we have the ventilation space. We had some of these big funnels that they had been used for the ventilation to make a bit more comfortable the space in terms of heat and smoke. So they had created this space as a space for women to listen to the debates. So one part of this research is also to understand how much these women that you can see here bending down from these window spaces, the gaps on the ventilator, down from the ceiling, you see the chandelier here, and the MPs debating on the ground floor. So how much they could actually hear. The evidence and the literature indicate that the women up there could hear much better than the people on the ground floor. And that is something that we are actually trying to explore as part of this project. Yes, the space was, it had a party atmosphere. The women were invited there. There were refreshments there. They were actually giving tickets to people. And we know also men were attending and listening from the debates as well too. And so we don't know yet if there was any noise or we have some information about the noise of the ventilation machine and how all of these combined together create this acoustic environment for the women to listen on the roof space. So how we start this project? We started the project carrying on a previous project that work had been done by Katrina Cooper, and Katrina had actually created an acoustic model in a geometric acoustic software that's called Acoustic. She had created the space as based on the evidence that they had for after Ren's renovation. So we see the panels on the sides, galleries, and some of the ventilation space on the ventilators on the ceiling. But this was much before what we were focusing on. So what we were trying actually to do with our new model, upgraded model 1820s, we brought the walls back. We set the panels from the windows back, so we have created extra space for people to sit between the pillars, the columns on the windows there, and some extra spaces on the galleries, some extra spaces on the top of the galleries. And we have also the ventilation space, and you see here the funnel where the women were sitting around this area. So our model, as Julian and Julian mentioned earlier, do not look like the VR models that you expect to see all the details. We are focusing more on the acoustic characteristics of the surfaces, that they give enough information for the acoustics, how the sound is reflected from the surfaces that they are important in acoustics, rather than small features, etc. So the colors and the details are not great, but we are focusing on the acoustic characteristics of these surfaces that we have designed. So here is our updated version of the model. And here we've done some changes on the model because we found that quite a lot of detail, and we know that from literature as well, a lot of detail in the models do not necessarily give enough or a good result, acoustic result. It might misinterpret what the acoustic geometric model will generate as impulse responses and acoustics. So we are trying to simplify things and make it more clear for the software to understand how the sound is reflected in different areas. So here we have the original detailed version of the sitting areas, and you can see from the architecture floor, and we can see seat by seat all the rows there. But that was quite complex for our model, so we simplified it and make it the audience area as one space, as what actually Gillian showed you earlier for the medieval chapel too. We don't have space to, as a reference, as I mentioned, to compare and say that indeed what we have built here is an accurate result. We are trying our best to understand, based on our experience, to understand what are the acoustic characteristics of the different surfaces, what materials were back then, what wood they used, different versions of the wood, different versions of fabric that they may had on the benches, different wooden floors, etc. So everything is based on our best estimation. We don't have something necessarily to compare, directly to compare with our models. The only thing that we could actually do in this project was the calibration, as we mentioned it earlier, is based on spaces that they look like or they have been used for parliamentary debates in the UK, with the same architecture style, with the stalls and the choir setting style sitting area on both sides. So here we have 5 spaces that we use to help us to understand the acoustics of our model. So here is the House of Commons nowadays, the modern House of Commons. Measurements of impulse responses and the acoustics of the space had been run from University of York. We have also spaces in the University of Oxford, the Convocation House and the Divinity School. These are in the Bodleian Library, and we have evidence that in the past, in the Civil War, they have been used for debates. They have been used for the parliamentary debates. So we know that the people back then understood that that could be used based on the political style that they followed, that they had been used for similar purposes. Another space is the Hollywood Music Room, which is again in Oxford, and the information that we have here is just that has been used as a music room, but the architecture style, it does look like quite close to what the space was in the House of Commons in the past. So we've done some measurements there as well. And another 5th space that we found very similar is the York Guildhall Council Chamber. It doesn't have the galleries as the galleries that we see in the House of Commons, but the dimensions are extremely close. It's a very, very similar space in terms of size, the volume, and the materials are very close to what we were aiming. So what we've done, we had some acoustic measurements in the spaces, and based on the results we got from our acoustic models, we compared, then we tried to understand how close we could actually go in our model. So here are some of the results. Here is the reverberation time of these spaces. Our model is the light blue, and as I said, it's very close to the Guildhall space, Guildhall Council Chamber in York. everything else, it's what we were actually expecting, to be honest. Yes, we use them as a way to compare, but we knew, for example, that the Divinity School, it's a very reverberant space. Its hard surfaces are all around, even if it looked like, and it had been used for debate, it's not wooden panels as it was in the House of Commons. So we did expect to see such differences, and that's actually helping us to verify what we have done in this model is quite close to what we were expecting. So also I have some realization results just to listen of what we have so far. We are going to have anechoic recordings of the space with speech from debates from the past. At the moment, I'm just using references from the software. Give me a second, I close the window. And here you can, the first example you will hear is the Prime Minister nowadays. We don't know if in the past they were using these seats anyway. So nowadays the Prime Minister is sitting here, so we are using that as a reference point and being listened from the speaker's chair.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
The second example I'm gonna give is the example 8, which is here. Is the Prime Minister still speaking and someone sitting on the galleries on top above the area of the same side of where the Prime Minister is sitting nowadays?
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
And I hope you could actually hear the difference in different locations, how clear it was from the speaker's chair, how clearly you perceive it from the speaker's chair, and how reverberant was on the gallery space, and how more difficult it is to understand the speech in the second one. And last example is the ventilation space.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
So that's the work that we are doing so far, and we are aiming to compare different locations and to understand how the debates, how the sound in the debates was perceived in different locations, and if that had a historical explanation of the decisions taken back then. Yes, that's me. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you very much. What I am going to pose one question/comment, and then we'll move on to Ronald and then see if we have more time for more at the end. But one thing that your presentation got me really excited about is Europeana as a database is mostly text and image, tens of millions of text and image objects, and audio and video and 3D models represent only a small subset. And what's really inspiring is how important images are to the work that you do when it comes to trying to better understand the sound of these spaces over time. I was wondering if you could speak briefly about how you go about that area of the research in terms of tracking down supplementary content for your research.
Well, my background is musicology, so I'm not historian, but we are all collaborating, and one of our collaboration colleagues from the University of New York are historians. So we started from this. We started all of the information that we had from history, anything that they are specialists in the history of the Parliament, and we continue with, of course, whatever evidence we find ourselves. And then we continue with finding expertise from the Parliament itself. So from the archives from the Parliament, we had a lot of discussions from the library archives, people from specialists on the ventilation space, specialists on the history in different periods of time in the space. So we are collaborating with historians for this purpose as well. It is very interesting, actually. It's very important not to have only the visual information, but how they perceived it. It's important element is the acoustics of it. So we always find very fascinating discussions that we have with historians as well. They found interesting the input of our work as well. So that's part of it, yes. We collaboration with many disciplines.
Pamela had to leave, but I'm sure she would be nodding her head when it comes to the importance of perception of sound in the spaces. I see some questions in the chat. We're going to save those and we're going to move on to Ronald, because I'm really curious what Ronald's going to have to comment on and also share after already seeing several visualizations of physical spaces and how those can potentially find their way into AAAF 3D.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can see my screen and hear me.
Yes, yes.
Thanks very much for the invitation as well. Great to be on the panel with others, and thanks everyone for coming along. I'll probably move fairly quickly, and some of these can be reviewed later and in the recording, just for time and for discussion purposes. So one of the things in IIIF, International Image Interoperability Framework, the 3D group, which has a community group and more recently a technical specification group, started talking about digital dioramas and actually preparation for a metaverse. And in all of these discussions, the aim is to bring 3D visual together with 2D audio and video and other elements. So really what we're aiming to do with many others is bring this together, which we've seen a number of examples of visual and audio, etc. Hopefully you've come across IIIF and is a close partner with Europeana, and there's crossover representation and a lot of work together, including the previous 3D task force of Europeana, which the IIIF 3D group was also contributing to that. Very widespread and growing, and we hope will help make sense and share more of the world's digital collections. Here's an example of a more recent standard that was British Library led on, but also there were participants all over, and it continues. There's an audio and video group so that sound archives, video archives can be incorporated. And all of that will be important for digital dioramas or metaverse. This is an experiment that lead developer for Universal Viewer, Ed Silverton, did to show how a traditional pictorial 2D representation in IIIF could be combined with a 3D model, top of the screen, and audio, a video clip. I'll come back to that idea of bringing things together. So a lot of the work is experimental to try to bring things together as well as to prove things. This is an interesting project. Some of you may have come across. University of York was involved with it, Leeds and London researchers, to 3D scan vocal cords that were intact in a mummy of a priest that's in collection in, I think, Leeds, and then vocalize through that. So the mummy speaks for the first time in 3,000 some years, which is quite amazing. But again, what we're all aiming to do, I think, is to pull these various pieces together so we have a more rich environment, in this case, 3D and audio, which is interesting. I'm going to skim over this, but suffice it to say that the various groups with lots of interaction also is keeping track of the various formats and how they can interoperate, which is a key bit, interoperability. I'll skim that. Those are from various organizations involved with the work. Sustainability and preservation is a key part of all of this. There's even some hope of the decolonization concerns of digitizing and swapping and being able to share resources. Because of time, I'll leave that for later. But we have a lot of look at workflows, and the interoperability also wants to make sure that some of this technology is available to less well-funded institutions, which I know is a common concern. And the idea of metaverse modularity, another way of talking about interoperability, is something even the larger companies who have changed their name in some cases, realize that they can't do this alone, and interoperability is a key part of all this. And that's true for the audio part. It is complicated, and this is more on a visual side, that XYZ is done differently, and that must also be relevant for audio, for instance, where you place them in a 3D environment. And just for fun, this is more the rectilinear side of things, but people like Google store their models typically in polar coordinates. So you have to be able to be happy with 3D geometry to move between this. And thankfully, I have lots of people who are happy to do that. So, but all of you who've worked with 3D models have had to wrestle with that placement, et cetera. And we saw examples, which is great. I'll skim over this, some of the challenges, the difference of workflow and output and post-production, which we all have to deal with, and interoperability challenges. There are a lot of viewers, a lot of file formats. There is some coming together of some of it. And in IIIF world, there's things need a manifest stored in JSON format. And increasingly, I think that's a Europeana interest as well. The sort of how you store metadata in a compact way. So there's a data model I know for Europeana. There are some standards for 3D on the web and the open web technologies. Some have forgotten about it. VRML, which is over 30 years old, has evolved into a very rich standard called X3D. And it can handle pretty much anything, including audio integration. So we have some examples of 3D models with audio, et cetera. And WebXR is a newer entrant, picking up again on lots of other work before it. And again, audio is an integral part of that, or can be. We've done a lot of work on stories, user stories, to try to get a clear sense of user use cases. And we've seen some examples, and that clearly will be important for the audio aspects as well as we grow this whole world and metaverse. This is a very brief sampling of some of the user stories. And a lot of it arguably will be more on the visual side. But there are some interest in multimedia and in organization integration. So I know I'm repeating that, but it's an important part of how this all stays together. This was an experiment, again, Ed Silverton did, and I'll leave that for later if you want to try it. But just putting together multiple models. So this is a composite scene together with music, and the dancer twirls around and you hear a music box sound, which is great. Exhibit.so, if you haven't come across it, is a good place to put together some stories and quizzes, etc. And you can combine 2D, 3D, and audio video material. It's available to anyone online, and that started for the University of St. Andrews, but it's widely available now, and I recommend it. Just some examples. If you haven't come across Hubs, Mozilla Hubs, it's definitely worth immersing yourself, pardon the pun. This is an environment using WebXR, they're one of the champions, available to everyone free, where you can set up a room environment, put 2D, 3D, audio, video, PowerPoint, etc., and integrate them, and move around with an avatar and even pose and take selfies. So here's an example next of students for 3D computer graphics in Brighton early on in the pandemic, not being able to gather together for an annual exhibition at the end of their course. So it was done online through Hubs, which is fascinating, I think. And again, you can mix materials and samples. There were some video and audio in that. I'm going to attempt this. This is an example just recently came up using 360 video and audio bubbles within a Mozilla Hubs environment, done by a group based in North Carolina, but working with Harvard Library and other groups. See if I can launch this baby. No. I'm just going to do basic navigation. I'm sort of moving back and forth, left, right, using keyboard. Can you see those bubbles?
Yeah.
You see the controls?
Yes.
Okay, that one's not working as well. It's not a perfect world, but let's see if we can get this one going. So this is 360 video. Can you hear that?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to pull out. And effectively, you get a Doppler shift, so it gets softer and there you can see there are even audio controls on the bubble. It's a fascinating experiment available to anyone to sort of try out what this kind of metaverse might look like. Now, in a way, one of the discussions we've been having is if you can combine 360 video and, in fact, audio in this case, with detailed 3D models, it's a kind of metaverse on the cheap, because it's going to be a while before we have fully rich, full 3D environments to wander through, although we have game environments and others doing that. This was kind of a thought experiment of what it might be like to take a famous painting, Nighthawks by Hopper, and on Sketchfab, someone had made a 3D model. So imagine that you could immerse yourself and not only listen, but maybe smell the coffee as well as hear the tunes they're playing in this. And with something like Hubs, it is certainly possible. Another kind of example just to think out loud together. This is one of the best examples I've come across of AR used together with a ruin site. This is in northern Italy, Brescia, a ruin site that has mapped onto it a recreation that you can see through AR glasses. Well, it's very easy to add audio to that, not just guide, but for some of the work we've been seeing elsewhere, maybe what would be the sounds as you approach the temple or in it. And that can be directional or spatial audio as well. Similarly, inside a cathedral in the area or a church, the AR is used to repaint the walls from the medieval paintings. And that might be interesting to hear the choirs, etc., as we were seeing earlier. This is an area that some have been dabbling with in their different devices. This is a Kickstarter just found. It's still being put together, but it's one of a number of ways people are trying to integrate more of the senses. And there are ways to augment all 5 senses, text being one of the stranger ones, I think, to approach. But this Kickstarter promises you can bolt this onto a VR headset and get smells and heat and wind. And some research suggests that if you have multisensory approach, it helps reduce dizziness, vertigo, etc. That's some experience with visual only, particularly in VR, I think. Let's skim over this. You know, there's a lot of work going on, including a big study, the EC backed for 3D digitization of tangible cultural heritage. A little bit of a shout out if you're interested. There's a lot of work going on, and IIIF 3D is working with others for a big metaverse conference that will be in Las Vegas next year. A group out of Manchester Metropolitan organizes that. And working with the IEEE Metaverse Congress, the Standards Association, to try to embed this interoperability that is needed for all purposes here. And I'll close with the great Nikos Kazantzakis talking about, well, effectively, we could hint this as what a metaverse would be, but the non-existent is whatever we have not sufficiently desired, which I think is interesting. And I just want a little glimpse of the animated skeleton, which I think is funny. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ronald. Could you put in the chat a link where people can find their way perhaps to the IIIF Slack? Because I think if more people working in the field of acoustics find their way into the IIIF 3D community, well,
Yeah.
only good things could come of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks.
And we did it right on time, 12 o'clock coming up, always a rewarding feeling. These presentations were recorded, and we're gonna talk about how and if and in what ways we're able to share any thing from this presentation. But thank you to all the speakers very much for kicking off EuropeanaTech's interest in heritage acoustics research. And thank you everyone in the audience for attending and asking questions and being interested. There should be a series of blogs coming out either this month or next month, diving deeper into this topic as well. So we're going to keep pushing more and more projects and research happening. So stay tuned, and thank you all